Today we are going to be talking about Active Directory consideration in a multi-tenant cloud infrastructure. Now, just a quick check, if you don't mind. Is there anybody in this room who is not thinking about cloud? The exit is that way. Okay. Now, is there anybody in this room who is thinking about cloud, but they're thinking, I'm going to be the only tenant in the cloud? I don't think so. So, our topic today is actually there is an element of tautology in there. What's a cloud without it being a multi-tenant infrastructure? So, when you start thinking about cloud, one of the primary considerations is you want to put things in there, and those things will not necessarily belong to one person. So today, we'll go into how you can implement your cloud, architect your cloud, plan your cloud with a view of providing the element of multi-tenancy in the cloud. Specifically, this mentions Active Directory. You can take this out and just reference LDAP. Specifically, we are talking about Active Directory today. We are going to talk about nothing earth-shattering. I'm not going to reveal any secret. There is no new product I'm going to mention, so you can safely ignore this disclaimer. I want you all to think back when you registered for VMworld. You probably registered a few weeks ago, or maybe a couple of months ago. I know you didn't register yesterday. Even if you did, you thought about how you're going to get here. And maybe a few hours before your flight or a few days before you packed things up, you made plans for the journey. You'll be hearing about the journey throughout the VMworld session this week, and I know you've been hearing about them. You make preparations for journeys. The cloud, getting into the cloud, staying in the cloud, operating in the cloud, is considered a complementary journey to the journey message that VMware has been talking to you about, and we continue to talk to you about. We'll do a brief introduction to vCloud concept. I know there are sessions, multiple sessions here that would go into details, and there are labs here where you can actually do a deep dive of what the cloud elements are. So in my session, we'll just do a quick overview introduction just to set the stage for what we are going to talk about today. We are not going to get into the deep nitty-gritty details of vCloud. We'll learn about the elements of multi-tenancy, and we will try and get into understanding the requirement, the configuration you need to support a multi-tenant cloud infrastructure on the VMware platform. We'll wrap up with how do you achieve coexistence and at the same time achieve separation. It's an oxymoron, but in a cloud, you want to be able to coexist, and then you want to be able to fence off a portion of it. You don't want an occupier, a tenant, to get access to another tenant's resource. And at the same time, you want some multiple tenants to be able to interact or have access to each other's content. This is the overall agenda. What's cloud tenancy? We'll talk about provider, organizations, vApp, and we'll define who is a tenant. Now we'll get into how or what are the considerations that you have to go through when you're thinking about Active Directory in the cloud. What do you need? And where do you need it? And we'll go through some multiple deployment scenarios. I plan to have some time left for questions, and I'll try to get your questions in. If we run over, I'll be outside by the door, and I will be at the several breakouts if you need to reach me. The journey. When you look at implementing a cloud, consider it a journey, a progression, a number of successive activities. It's not an end state. So I meshed this up with the messaging, the VMware messaging for this VMworld, and we are going to progress along, build the infrastructure or understand the infrastructure, the underlying Active Directory or LDAP infrastructure that will get you along that journey smoothly. Let's define the cloud concept in terms of the VMware vCloud director, which is essentially what we're talking about here today. In the VMware cloud, vCloud, there is a provider. A provider is essentially the administrative owner of a cloud instance. A particular cloud instance must have a provider. A provider is instantiated or represented by what you call a provider virtual data center, a PVDC. Every cloud instance will have a PVDC. That PVDC or the provider owns these elements in the cloud, the compute resources in the cloud, and share it out to tenants. Now, a provider can also be a tenant in that cloud, but there is still that overarching apex. The apex of the cloud is the provider. An organization is a unit of multi-tenancy. It represents a logical security boundary within a cloud. It contains users, resources, and it contains network. Everything you do, look at a representation of your physical data center today. If you list a colo, you get a subset of a structure where you put your 2U or 4U or whatever, and your racks and your gears and your network. Consider that as the organization concept in the cloud. And then you have the vApp. The vApp is a container. It's an envelope, essentially, for a software solution. Every VM you deploy in a VMware vCloud is instantiated inside, is wrapped inside a vApp. It can contain one or more. So, provider, organizations, vApps, essential elements of a cloud. Again, you can learn more about this all in details, either at the lab or at the several breakout sessions. A tenant is a consumer of resources in a cloud. These resources are allocated by the provider. A tenant is logically distinguishable from an organization. An organization, of course, is a tenant. But when you can have an organization that has multiple departments or a business unit, or within the business unit, you have multiple teams, and each of these teams need an instance, or they need a space in the cloud. Now, if you take your IT department, put them in the cloud, that IT department becomes an organization. The IT department can have the lab, they can have the developers, they can have other things. Those other three elements I just mentioned, they also become tenants. They are not organically tied to the IT department. So you can have an organization that has other organizations, that has other organizations. So in a tenancy, in a cloud, it's a unit of occupation. I'll get into that as we go through the slides. Then, if you look at down there, I said tenancy agreement, and the agreement is in quote. When you have a tenant in in a cloud instance, there are some requirements that they want to meet, that they want you to satisfy, and they expect. And it is your responsibility as a provider of that cloud instance to meet those agreements, those requirements. So, I'm assuming that you've had time, or you are a little bit conversant with the vCloud concept from VMware. The vCloud relies on the availability of an LDAP, an authorization or authentication store. Okay? Underlying the cloud instance is there is a mechanism for you to authenticate, to authorize access to the cloud. When you start thinking about putting your cloud together, you start to think, okay, I will need this department, and I will need that business unit, and I want them to be able to access resources, but I don't want them to be able to do X, Y, Z. I want them to be able to do ABC and CDE, but I don't want them to be able to do the other ones. What are the reasons, or what are the factors influencing how you implement your Active Directory inside the cloud? How you use the cloud, the Active Directory to back up the cloud? The primary requirement I've heard in the field from so many people is single sign-on. And this is up here just so I can quickly dismiss this. We know today that we do not facilitate single sign-on natively with vCloud Director. I promised I wasn't going to reveal any upcoming or any secret, so we'll just proceed with one of the requirements for multi-tenancy in a cloud is single sign-on, which we don't achieve today. Now, the other element is cloud-wide authentication. If you're a provider, you are faced with, okay, do I want to implement Active Directory as a service for my tenants? Do I want to take on the ownership or the responsibility of facilitating authentication and authorization for them? And can I do that as an add-on service? That's another consideration. Then you have the organization need. So when you get down from the provider and you get down to the organization is looking at, okay, I'm going to put all these workloads in the cloud, but this workload requires some specific PCI compliance, for example, regulatory compliance, EPA, whatever. So I need authorization and authentication. I need some ways to control who has access to what. That is another consideration that affects where you put LDAP or how you architect for LDAP or Active Directory specifically. Also, you want to have level of access. As an organization, you have your administrators and you have your just regular users. All the regular users need is just access to a VM, power it on, do whatever they need to do, and go away. Then you have the administrators who need to be able to control multiple aspects of that cloud instance. Thank you very much. Also, as you will see in a subsequent slide and present a demo I have, there is also the need for you to facilitate coexistence. This is my corporate network. I have a corporate LDAP, I have a corporate Active Directory. I want to be able to put some workload in the cloud, but the things they rely on, maybe I don't want to put those in the cloud yet, but I want them in my corporate facility, in my colo or whatever. That's another consideration when you start thinking about how do I architect my Active Directory. And okay, so there is the cloud, and then I have the corporate. I want this to be easy for people to access. I don't want to introduce complication because what is cloud? other than to provide ease of administration and other things. Make your life easier, make your end user lives easier. Operationally sounder than you were in the physical world. And then there is the application need. You have applications that you will put in the cloud. Do they need Active Directory? Do they need access to authorization? Do they need to write to a partition? Do they need to update anything? That's another consideration. And you have the developer's scenario, or you have a testing scenario, lab scenario, where you just occasionally spin up a bunch of VMs, do your testing, and forget about it. Those two you have to account for when you start deliberating on how you want to architect your Active Directory. Please bear with me. This next slide can make you dizzy. And the reason it can make you dizzy is when you sit down, when you put pen to paper, and you start talking and you start meeting and you start thinking about the different ways that you will need AD support in the cloud, it's cyclical. So I don't want to spin you around, but there's no other way for me to describe this to you other than this way. When you sit down, you start thinking about how you are going to architect your Active Directory for your cloud. The first thing you want to do, or you will look at is, okay, this Active Directory I'm talking about, is it for the service provider? You are the service provider. Again, remember, the service provider is at the apex. Is this Active Directory going to support the cloud infrastructure, the what we call the management pod, just the vCloud itself, not tenants or not occupants? If the answer to that is no, then we don't have anything to do with this Active Directory. If it's not for the provider, and if it's not supporting the vCloud infrastructure, well, it's not in consideration. There's no reason for you to be here. That's not what we're talking about today. Now, if it's yes, this Active Directory is only going to support the vCloud director, the charge bag, and the other elements that make you, or that enables you to build up a cloud instance and then share it out. Well, that Active Directory will be a provider AD. It's only dedicated to that. It should be only dedicated to that purpose. Okay? Now, if the Active Directory we're talking about, the one you're deliberating on, is not to back up the cloud director instance, then we have to ask, is this going to be a dedicated provider virtual data center? If the answer is yes, does it need to support unique authentication? Or can we just put users in one OU and forget about it? They don't care where they are and they can access anything? If the answer to that is we don't require unique authentication, well, you can share the AD instance that's backing up the cloud director. Please bear with me. If the answer is no, or if you require unique authentication for this LDAP, for this AD, then you have to ask yourself, am I going to support multiple organizations with this LDAP, with this Active Directory instance? And if it's no, we know we require a separate AD instance from the one that's backing up the director, but there's only one single organization. We are not going to support multiple organizations. Now, then you ask yourself, will I need my corporate AD to interact with this AD, am I extending the corporate boundary? If the answer to that is no, now we're talking about the organization, the tenant inside this cloud. We've gone past the provider side. So do you want, or do I want, as an organization, as a tenant, do I want to manage this AD myself, or do I want the provider to manage it? If I don't want to manage it myself, then just tell the provider to give you a custom LDAP. If you've seen vCloud Director, you can see that in the organization, at the organization level, you can create custom LDAP to connect to a specific LDAP, to connect to a specific Active Directory. These are the decision maze. Again, I know it's confusing, but when you go back to your office and you start to draw up the Active Directory considerations for your cloud, these are the things you will go through. And what I've tried to do here is give you some ideas of how you go about answering the questions. Now, if I, as the occupant, as the tenant, as the organization, I want to manage my own AD myself, I don't want the provider to have anything to do with it, then I have to ask myself, the workload I'm going to put in here, is it going to be a transient workload, a cyclical workload? Is this something I would use for 2 weeks and destroy? You know why that's important? Because it helps you decide whether or not you're going to instantiate a different Active Directory inside that instance, or if you're going to use a copy of your Active Directory that you have somewhere. Now, why is that important? We will get to that at the end, close to the end. But let me just quickly tell you, if you are putting a DC, a domain controller, inside a vApp, and that vApp is usually just used maybe for 2 weeks and thrown away, you have a lot of cleanups to be doing in your live Active Directory infrastructure. So that's why it is important for you to ask this question. Is the workload that this AD is going to support, is it going to be transient or is it going to be permanent? If the answer is no, let's walk back from the top again. This is not supporting multiple organizations. No, it's not extending the corporate boundary. So we know we're going to put an LDAP, an AD inside this organization. Do I want to manage it myself? Yes. Okay. In this instance, as an organization, you will instantiate an Active Directory infrastructure to support your unique need at this point. Have I lost you? Again, I apologize. It's a lot of deliberations when you think about how to architect AD to support your vCloud, because there are so many multiple uses, so many variations. That's why you have this maze. I will call it a flow chart, but it's not really. Now, if the workload is going to be transient, it's going to be cyclical, it's going to be weekly, monthly, or whatever, put that DC, put the Active Directory instance, bundle it with your vApp. Okay? Create a vApp, put whatever workload you want in there, put Active Directory domain controllers in there, and let people instantiate it every time they need it. When they don't need it, they destroy it. It's self-contained inside that vApp. It doesn't pollute your live AD. You don't need to do any after-the-fact cleanup. Now, we stopped. Let me see if I know how to use this. We stopped here, walked all the way down, because we said this AD would not support multiple organizations. Now, what if the AD would support multiple organizations? You as the provider, if you want to instantiate, maybe as a service, you want to offer LDAP, AD, as a service to your organization, to your tenants, and you want that single AD to support multiple infrastructure, are they common? If they're yes, if it's yes, it's common, then because you're providing it, you will have to put that live AD instance inside the organization. Now, it's different from putting AD inside a vApp. You put it inside a vApp if it's a transient workload. But if it's going to be a permanent one, it will be inside your organization. So there will be, with all the workloads you have in there, there will be LDAP, domain controllers, Active Directory, everything as part of your workload inside that organization. Now, you have common infrastructure. They're going to use one AD. But in this case, you will use one AD. If it's not common, then we still ask ourselves the question. We know now we need separate. Does it need to be, is it going to also be a transient AD usage? And if it's yes, again, that DC, that AD instance goes inside the vApp. Again, it reduces the cleanup you have to do at the end of the day. If it's not, it's a permanent workload. I am going to put my Exchange in the cloud. The Exchange will need AD constantly. And no, I'm not going to destroy my Exchange after 2 weeks. It's going to be permanent. Then we still have to ask ourselves, again, are you going to extend the corporate boundary? No. The DC will go inside the organization, inside each organization, because here, these are not common AD infrastructure. Multiple organizations will be here, and each organization will have its own DC. I'm sorry, again, I said this is very complicated, but you'll get this slide, and you will be able to use this as a template when you go through your discussion and you start to map out your AD considerations. So we are extending the corporate boundary. We want our corporate to be able to to be able to connect or interact or have some connection with the AD infrastructure that we have in the cloud. So we're going to say, do we require separation? If we say yes, okay, the AD inside the cloud will be within the organization, and then you will create a trust. Full, one way, whichever, but you will need to create a trust to extend your corporate boundaries into the cloud. So if you don't require a domain separation, you want to use the same AD that you have in your corporate facility inside the cloud, then we'll ask you again, do you need a writable DC? Do you have applications that need to write to the DC or to LDAP? And if the answer to that is no, the easiest one, the safest one for you to do is just put a read-only domain controller inside the cloud. Okay? Your writable domain controllers will be at your corporate offices or whichever one is not in the cloud yet. Now, if you don't need, okay, I'm sorry. This is where we are. You need a writable domain controllers? Is no. Well, if you don't need a writable domain controller, then put a full DC, because if you put your Exchange or a workload that requires ability to write to the DC inside the cloud, and you don't put a writable DC near that workload, well, I'm sure you are familiar with the implications. So, I apologize for the twist here, but there is no easier way for me to explain this and to give you something that you can take back to your offices when you start to deliberate on how you're going to architect your AD infrastructure. Now, Everything I've talked about so far is now in the following slides. When I talked about service provider provided AD, this is what the architecture will look like. And I'll try to explain briefly. Up here, we see the service provider, and we see the vCloud infrastructure. There is an LDAP there. There's AD here, back in that vCloud instance. And then you have this. This is the tenant, okay? And this service provider is providing LDAP, AD, as a service to the tenants. There is a silver level of customers here. They pay some money to get these services from the provider. And they have just a subdomain, a child domain of the provider's AD, and they use that within the cloud. They don't have anything else extending to their boundary. Now, if you look at this, these guys here are the gold, okay, and all they required was just an OU inside the provider's AD. What's the benefit of that? It's easy for you to deploy. As a service provider, you deploy a Active Directory infrastructure that's solely to service or to provide authentication, authorization, and other services for your tenants. And you get paid for that. You charge back somehow because now they are premium services. It's a revenue stream for you. But it's very inflexible. You cannot really do some customization for the customer. It's either they take the LDAP you've implemented or nothing. It can lead to sprawling. You can have multiple OUs, nested OUs, and all that. And you can have multiple domains, and depending on how many tenants you have in the cloud, it can lead to sprawling. It's complex to implement. And then you have the networking considerations. You will hear about how you extend cloud to cloud or cloud to your corporate offices and the network requirement, VCDNI. You will hear about those either in the lab or the breakout sessions. Those are the cons, the negative impact of doing provider-hosted Active Directory. But again, it's easy to deploy. It's just complex to manage. This is the hybrid. This is a little extension of what we just discussed. And here, you still have the provider-provided Active Directory. But now you have where some tenants, like this, for example, is not using the provider-provided AD. This provider is using its own local in-cloud, in-organization AD. At the same time, you have other tenants that are still using the provider-provided. So with one instance, with one vCloud instance, you can satisfy multiple requirements for LDAP, authentication, authorization, and other needs. That's what this is explaining. You can have one where they have their own AD instance inside the cloud, and you can still service other requests for other people. Scooby can be an OU under your own provider-provided AD. It's easy to deploy. It's easy for you to manage because now this tenant has its own AD, and you don't have to worry about that particular tenant. If those tenants want to have their own AD inside your cloud, you don't have to worry about it. You as the provider, it's easy for you. You shift the burden of the administration of the Active Directory over to the tenant. You don't have to worry about it. Of course, you're not getting the money, but that's something else. We know we're not in this for profit. Now, look at the cons. The customers, your tenants, please remember, your tenants can be a department. They can be a business unit. They can be just a team. They may not have the expertise to do Active Directory. Okay? So, if you're telling them, you're on your own, go implement your own LDAP, you have this. And they'll call you, something is broke, I don't know what it is. And then you have where multiple tenants in your organization are deploying their own Active Directories. They will need, as a good practice, of course, you want to have more than one domain controllers. So you have multiple VMs that are doing the same thing. If you have multiple tenants, you're just utilizing resources that could be used to service multiple people. And then you have, that's duplication. You still have the technical constraints of the networking routing. I'm sorry, this is getting to a close. What I've drawn up here is where you have an organization or a vApp implementation, like I mentioned earlier, for transient workload, you encapsulate or you put your DCs inside a vApp because that vApp is only dedicated for a specific purpose. Maybe your web server, Win7, and a test server, and a DB. That instance of vApp, all it needs is in here. It needs Active Directory, but it doesn't need to go outside. It doesn't need to, you just want this for when somebody says, I need something to test with that has AD. Okay, it's inside vApp. At the same time, you see this customer, El Charo, can satisfy this requirement and at the same time be able to use its own LDAP for other workloads inside the same cloud instance. That's why I call this hybrid with a vApp and an organization level authentication. And you can see here, it's not relying on the provider-provided LDAP at all. Again, it's easy to deploy. You still have the wastage. You still have the fact that it's a little bit complex. It's more complex than you as the provider doing everything for them and say, I'll bill you for it. This is about federation. This is about trust. This is a replica of the things we'll be discussing, but with an emphasis on facilitating the elasticity of the cloud, extending the boundary of your corporate infrastructure into the cloud. In this way, when you extend your corporate infrastructure, of course you still don't have the single sign-on, but you avoid account duplication. So a user has one account, and it's the same account. If you federate or if you do trust or you do some other things, they can easily access resources in the cloud. Even though it's not single sign-on, they know their daily password, they know their username, and they can access resources in the cloud more easily if you implement it this way. It's complex because of the trust. It's complex because of federation. It's complex because of networking and routing. And if your corporate network is disconnected from the cloud, can't reach the cloud, well, you can reach the cloud. So that's a drawback. I know that was heavy on graphics, and it was heavy on animation. I wanted to give you enough, as much as I can pack into a PowerPoint presentation so that when you go back and you start thinking about this and you start holding your series of meetings and you start deliberating on what are you going to require. Of course, you're going to need storage. Yeah, you're going to need networking. Of course, you will need to license. But when you get all those things together and you want to start a journey, if your car's tire is not inflated or if it's missing a wheel, you're going nowhere fast. You need LDAP to support the cloud infrastructure, and that will be one of your main deliberations, one of your main big issues to figure out how many business units will require unique authentications, how many workload will need writable domain controllers, how many of your tenants have the capacity or the expertise to manage their own AD, how much of your workload will be just use and delete, vApp, reusable, you just deploy from templates, you're done with it, or delete it. And if you have many of those, do you want to have those workload tie into your AD, and then when you delete those workloads, you have to go back and go clean AD? Those are the things you have to deliberate, and I'm hoping that the heavy graphics and the heavy animation, when you get back to your office, they will be useful to you, and you'll be able to glean some information that will help you make a good decision on how you architect your Active Directory to support your vCloud. I know some of you here, I've met some of you here. It's funny that I met you on the other side of the fence. I used to be a directory services MVP. So directory services, Active Directory is my big thing. And even before I joined VMware, we've always had the thing about, don't virtualize domain controllers. If you're going to virtualize domain controllers, make sure you don't virtualize this FISMO role. Make sure you leave one on physical, at least. No, don't do that, do this. Well, I can tell you, standing in front of you, there is no reason for you to not virtualize a domain controller. There is no FISMO role in Active Directory that is more important than any other FISMO role. It's not the read. It's not the schema master. Every one of them is equally important, and there is no technical reason, technical drawback, or any other considerations that will hold you back from virtualizing any type of domain controller today. No need to keep a physical. It's a zombie. We killed that years ago. And if you're familiar with virtualizing Exchange and all the things that were said about don't do HA with DAG and all that, we just killed that zombie too. When you do virtualize a domain controller or domain controllers, one of the things that you have to be worried about or that you have to bear in mind, have in the back of your mind at all time, is the element of time synchronization. Time hierarchy, good timekeeping is very important in any LDAP facility, especially Active Directory. One good thing to keep in mind, don't sync your VM to your ESX host, especially if those VM have workloads that are AD members, joined to AD domain. Use the Active Directory domain time hierarchy. You can't miss with that. Don't sync your domain controller to your ESX host. Sync your PDCE to any reliable time source. If you can get out of your internal network and you can't get outside to ntp.org or whatever, find a reliable time source that is not your ESX server to sync your PDCE to. And actually, you want to make sure that your PDCE and your ESX servers are syncing to the same source. When AD first hit the market in the 99s, 2000s, one of the biggest changes was its reliance on DNS. And it is still true today. DNS is a very big one, not just for your domain controller that you're going to virtualize, but for your cloud infrastructure and the workloads that you're going to put in there. We expect to have reliable name resolution. You want to keep an eye on that when you are moving workloads, especially domain controllers, into the cloud. I mentioned encapsulating or putting your DC inside a vApp if it's going to be a transient workload, if it's not going to be permanent. I briefly mentioned why you want to do that. Again, clean up. You don't want to be doing that on your live network, on your live AD. Another thing is, if you put an AD, a DC, inside a vApp that is not always on, and that DC is a member of your corporate Active Directory, now what do you think happens? So you powered off this vApp, you powered off this DC, and maybe 3 weeks later somebody comes, or 3 months later, somebody comes and say, oh, let's turn it on. You just created problems. So if you're going to have a workload that is not going to be a permanent workload, never put a copy of your live DC inside that vApp. And that's what I try to say here and here. USN rollback is one of the common things you will run into if you do that. And I'm sure since you are here, many of you are familiar with Active Directory, and you know how hard it is to recover from USN rollback. You don't want to go there. We've talked about the concepts, provider, the organization, the vApp, the tenant, the multiple needs, and the multiple ways you can architect or you can account for Active Directory, for authentication, for authorization inside of vCloud. Some customers or your customers will come to you, your business unit will come to you and tell you they need to be able to do this inside a vApp, or they need to be able, they want their own domain controllers. You need to ask the question, why? Just because they want it does not mean they need it. Now, when you are equipped with the different scenario or the different ways you can account for LDAP or for Active Directory inside the cloud, you will be able to maybe not aggressively push back, but justify your no way answer. You don't need it. We can facilitate what you want to do by doing this. Okay? Where you need it, what the workload is, what your billing system or your chargeback system is. If you get paid per VMs, or you get paid per utilization, or you get paid by premium services, will dictate whether or not you let people, or you let your organizations, your tenants, do their own AD, or do it on their own, or if you want to get involved. So you have to quantify the level of effort that's required to support that and the benefit, do a cost-benefit analysis and say, okay, do I want the help ticket to be coming to me? Are they paying me for that? Or is it required of me to support that? Now, many of the things I mentioned, I tried to provide some links for further reading. especially virtualizing AD infrastructure. This is a VMware published material. It's on the web, and you can it's a very good reading, if I do say so myself. And I'll stop now in case you have any question. I hope it's been beneficial to you. And if you don't want to ask a question openly here, again, I'll be here, and I'll be outside by the door if you need to talk more about it. We didn't go through the details of Active Directory because I don't think it's really relevant for this session. But if you want to ask me specific questions on directory services as it relates to VMware, not generally, I'll be feeding questions outside. And I thank you for coming. I hope it's been beneficial to you, and enjoy your VMworld.